Welcome to the July Community IT webinar. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about building your IT department for nonprofits. Today's webinar kicks off a series of discussions around good practices for IT operations and organizational structure to be followed up next month by project management and planning. My name is Matthew Eshelman, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at Community IT, and I'm also happy to say that I started as an intern just a little over 16 years ago this week. We'd like to share our before we begin. Most importantly, we encourage you to interact with us by asking questions via the GoToWebinar chat feature. I'll be moderating today's meeting and we'll be incorporating questions as we go along. We'd also like to remind you to avoid multitasking during the webinar, as you may just miss the best part. If you do miss the best part or need to leave the webinar early, don't worry, we'll be posting links to the recording and slides on our website, YouTube channel, and SlideShare accounts. If you're not familiar with Community IT, our skilled and certified team of IT professionals serves the greater Washington nonprofit community, helping organizations of all sizes and capacities to advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We're deeply invested in the nonprofit community, having served over 900 nonprofit organizations since 1993, and we take a strategic and collaborative approach that fits the unique needs and culture of nonprofit organizations. Now, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter today, Community IT's CEO, Johan Hammerstrom. Johan?
Hey Matt, thank you very much. Really happy to be here and looking forward to talking today about building an effective IT department for nonprofit organizations. Before we get started, we have a quick poll we'd like to shoot out to you, just asking about the size of your organization. So if you could take a moment and just respond to that poll, that would be great.
Great. We'll leave this open just a few more moments. Thanks everybody for your response. It's always good to start off with a little bit of demographic information to see who's in the audience today. Okay, I think we got just about everybody. So it looks like today in the audience we've got quite a wide range between some small organizations with under 20 folks and quite a big chunk with in that middle tier, 21 to 50, and then on up to over 100. So thanks everybody for your response. Appreciate it.
Great, thank you. So it's nice to see such a wide variety of organizations represented in our audience today, and I think you'll find that how we think about building an IT department is truly applicable for organizations kind of across the board, from the smallest to the largest. So I think you'll find this to be a very relevant and interesting webinar. So let's go ahead and get started here. So as always, while the topic for today's webinar is the IT department, our focus really is on IT success. And that's certainly why we at Community IT exist, to help pursue and promote IT success in the nonprofit sector. And I suspect that most of you joining the webinar today are doing so because you're interested in achieving, promoting, pursuing IT success at your organizations. And there are a lot of factors that go into creating IT success at an organization. But in our experience, there's really one primary factor that's determinative. In other words, if you lack organizational maturity, or if you aren't intentional about developing organizational maturity at your organization, then your chances for success in IT are very, very limited. IT success is hard to come by without the proper organizational maturity that's there to support it. And we'll explain what that means in a little bit more detail later on in the presentation. But really, if organizational maturity is so important for creating and fostering IT success, then the question becomes, how do you build maturity around IT? What's the approach that you should take? And so we're going to start with an approach that we've taken over the last 4 or 5 years that we've found to be very helpful, and that is what we call a services orientation. And services orientation is essentially an approach that comes to us from ITIL or ITIL, And ITIL, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is an IT management framework that was developed in the UK over the past 30 years. And services orientation or services focus is really kind of the starting point or the fundamental principle of the ITIL approach. And we found that it's a really helpful way to think about creating organizational maturity around IT. So we're going to start by talking about that, what the services orientation means. And then I think you'll find that that leads in really well into this discussion of generating organizational maturity. So the services orientation is based on this very precise definition about what constitutes an IT service. An IT service is one or more IT systems that enable a business process or function. And this is key because oftentimes when people think about IT, whether it's inside or outside the IT department, they think of IT as the IT system, right? It's the workstation, the servers, the cloud services. But it's important to think about IT not as the systems, but rather as the business process or function that are enabled and supported by the systems. And so you can never, these things are really connected together. And if you lose sight of the way in which the systems support the business process or function, then you're moving out of a services-oriented approach. And you're moving away from a situation in which IT is creating value for the rest of the organization. So when we think about the IT department, oftentimes people will think about, well, the IT department is that collection of computers, workstations, laptops, hardware that sits in a closet that no one wants to think about. Nowadays, it's the cloud services where a lot of our information is stored. That is the IT department. But the services-oriented approach doesn't look at the IT department as that collection of systems. Rather, it looks at it as the value that's created or the way in which those systems really enable the business process and function of the rest of the organization. And that's really important to be mindful of. And I just saw a comment that someone's having some challenges hearing me, that the audio is going in and out. We had some issues with the audio a little bit earlier on GoToWebinar's end. So I might need to switch to a different method of audio if that continues to be the case. How are things sounding on
the audio sounds good over here.
Okay.
So we switched from the mic and speakers to dialing in. So if you're having problems with the computer audio, it might be worth just dialing in. So thanks for the feedback, and we'll continue to monitor it as we go along.
Okay. Yeah, great. If no one can hear me, we want to do something about it. If a couple of individuals are having problems, try dialing in, and it might help. Great. So again, IT department, not just the systems, it's the services, which are the systems that enable a business process or function. So you can also think of the IT department or function as the group in an organization that creates value for the rest of the organization through the implementation and maintenance of IT services. And oftentimes, organizations will think that they need to be a certain scale or a certain size to have a full IT department. And that's unfortunate, because if you're one of these smaller organizations that maybe have 20 staff or less, and you just think we have a tight budget, there's a limited number of staff that we can hire, there's no way that we can build out an IT department. Oftentimes in those situations, organizations just kind of give up. They sort of abandon the concept of an IT department altogether. And unfortunately, in our experience, that really cuts off the possibility for IT maturity, before it can even start. So that's why I've got here not just IT department, but also IT function. So I like to think of it, as much as a function of the organization as it is a department within the organization. In other words, a department is really a kind of, it's a sort of a unit of organizational capacity as much as it is a collection or a group or a team of people. And I think thinking about the IT department, quote unquote, and I think using that term is helpful because it's consistent across a wide variety of organizations. but thinking about it more as an organizational capacity or a unit of organizational capacity is, in my view, very helpful. And I think what's really interesting is that that's a challenge not just for smaller organizations. Achieving really this sort of services-oriented approach isn't just a challenge for smaller organizations that lack the size to have, a full IT department in their view, but it can also be a challenge for larger organizations that have enough staff to have an IT department, but aren't always fulfilling this purpose. The objective of the IT department should be to increase value for the rest of the organization through increasing maturity, through generating value, business value for the rest of the organization, through implementing and maintaining IT systems. And that, that's not always the case. Oftentimes IT departments can be very sort of, focused more on the systems themselves rather than on the value that's being created for the rest of the organization. So a common framework or approach for improving maturity, because that's what we're trying to do here, it kind of goes back to that first slide with the bonsai tree. We want to improve the organizational maturity, improve the organization's capacity. And in a variety of disciplines, a method for improving maturity or a way of thinking about improving maturity is the maturity model. And the maturity model, the most famous one is the capability maturity model. But Gartner developed a maturity model called the infrastructure and operations maturity model that can really be applied to this problem of building up the maturity of IT departments. So this here is the Gartner IOMM, Infrastructure and Operations Maturity Model. And as you can see, it starts with, the basic level is survival, where you have no awareness that there's a problem, no awareness of, IT systems, you're just kind of going from fire to fire. The first level is awareness that there's a problem, and then you can see you kind of move up from there. You commit to solving, the shortcomings of the IT function in the organization. Once you've committed, you start to become more proactive, you start to align the services. And the pinnacle, of course, is where IT is a business partner with the rest of the organization. What's helpful, so this model in and of itself is helpful, but what's also helpful is kind of looking at the two axes that form the progress that you can make in advancing your maturity. So those axes are, on the one axis, business alignment. So this maturity improvement means increasing alignment between IT and the rest of the business. That very much fits with the services-oriented approach. And then on the other axis, you're increasing the management capability. So I took this maturity model and actually superimposed it on another Gartner structure, which many of us have come to know and either love or fear, I'm not sure, but the Gartner quadrants. So one axis, we've got business alignment. So down at the bottom is non-aligned, up at the top is aligned. And on the other axis, we have management capability. So off on your left, the IT department is unmanaged, or the IT function is unmanaged, and off to your right, the IT function is managed. So let's see, what are the characteristics of each of these four quadrants? So, if your IT is unaligned, you don't have business alignment between the IT systems and the business needs of the organization, and your IT is not well managed, you're going to have dysfunction. And I think many of us have experienced this or seen this either firsthand or in other organizations. Lack of management, lack of business alignment leads to IT dysfunction. And there's a lot of pain there. And that's the survival mode, that level 0 in the maturity model. What does it look like if your IT is well managed but not well aligned with the business needs of the organization? Then it becomes a cost center. And I think many of us have experienced this as well, where IT is constantly being asked to cut costs. IT is not seen as delivering value to the organization, and so very little investment is made in IT, or the investment that is made is sort of constantly questioned and needs to continually justify itself. And I always feel like this is a result of the systems not being aligned with the business needs of the organization. And maybe they are, but if it's not being communicated to key stakeholders in the organization, then for all intents and purposes, it's not aligned. And we'll talk about that in more detail as well. So this is, third quadrant, I think that's what that is. This is always the place that you want to be. If your IT services are aligned with the business needs of the organization and it's well managed, then you're creating value. So you might be asking now, okay, well, what's in that other quadrant? What is an IT department where the systems are aligned with business, but it's not very well managed? That's the unicorn. I have not found it yet. It may be out there. If anyone has experienced this, I would love to hear from you. I have no idea what it would look like, but it may exist, but we have not seen it yet. So if we want to move to that upper quadrant where IT is aligned with the business needs of the organization and is well managed, the place to start in our experience is with the overall structure. Like, how is the IT department or IT function structured within the rest of the organization? So we're going to take a few slides here to talk about a structure, a way of thinking about structure that we think leads to increasing IT maturity. Whoops, there we go. This is it. So there's kind of three things that you need to keep in mind. At the top is governance. So you got to make sure that your overall governance with regards to IT is in place and functioning well. Governance is interacting with management, which also needs to be in place and set up to succeed. And then from there, you can kind of build out the IT department. And what's important to realize, kind of the key point on this slide, is that a lot of the conditions for success in an IT department, to some extent, exist outside the IT department. An IT department can be, really well constructed and well built, but if the governance structures above it in the organization aren't in place, it's going to have a hard time succeeding and achieving its objective.
Yeah. And Johan, I think that's a really good point to make, and I know you and I had some discussion in terms of the visualization of this. To some extent, good governance does come from the top, or potentially the board, and kind of flow down. But at the same time, having good governance is really a foundation for IT success, and so could also be viewed as being that kind of base layer to really enable the management and then the IT department to carry out their work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It could just as easily kind of go on the bottom of this slide as on the top.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, I think in our experience relating this to the maturity model, we've worked with organizations where the IT department functioned very well, but because they had a lack of good governance, wasn't able to really move the organization forward or make those good kind of IT investments. And once good governance comes in, then we're able to see a lot of that momentum kind of up the maturity model in terms of being a lot more successful in driving those IT investments.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be frustrating because if you're involved in IT at your organization, you may or may not have control over what happens with the governance. And it's hard to be in a situation where you're limited by forces that are outside of your control. But I mean, that's organizational reality oftentimes. And I think more it's most important to be aware of that, to understand what sort of limitations governance may have over the situation of the IT department. Let's talk a little bit about the role of governance, the purpose of governance, and some of its characteristics. So the purpose of governance is really to hold the IT department accountable for creating business value for the rest of the organization through IT services. So that's that. Basically, the role of governance is to make sure that the IT department is fulfilling kind of a services orientation approach. Now, oftentimes, governance, and we'll talk about who that is in a minute, but may be willing to do this, but may not necessarily know how to, and so that's where the we'll talk also about the importance of kind of dialogue between the different elements of that structure. It's very much, I think, even though it's sort of portrayed in sort of a top-down way, it's actually much more of an interaction and dialogue between the different elements. So some of the ways that governance does that is through approving strategy, owning the outcomes. I think accountability and ownership are a really important part of governance. Making key decisions and approving the budget. This is just a sample list. There are other things that can go in there. But it's important that there's a body outside of the IT department that's fulfilling these objectives. Oftentimes, if IT is kind of on its own, it'll sort of go about its own business and not really involve the rest of the organization in approving strategy. And that's sort of an absence of governance in our view, and that's something that leads to problems down the road. A number of organizations will have sort of an IT working group or an IT committee, and those can be very successful if either they're empowered or their sort of connection to the decision makers is clear, if there's sort of a clear connection. But that third point of making key decisions can't be overestimated. It's really important that the governance role in IT be played by someone who has the authority to make decisions. So who's in the governance role? Who sits in the governance seat? Well, in an ideal world, I think it would be a CIO who is on the senior leadership team or the executive team of an organization, who's kind of empowered by the organization to make key decisions. That is particularly for smaller organizations. That is often not the case. It can be hard. In some cases, it just doesn't make sense, for an organization to have a CIO. They're either not large enough, or the role of IT isn't significant enough that it requires having a CIO. In many cases, it's going to be the COO, either someone who's involved in the overall operational leadership and management of the organization, or someone who's involved in the overall financial leadership and management of the organization. It could also be a team, the executive team or the senior team. It can be, as I mentioned earlier, like an IT committee, to the extent that either they're able to make decisions or their connection with decision making is sort of clearly articulated. So let's talk a little bit about management. So the purpose of management is really to ensure that the IT department is creating value for the rest of the organization through the implementation and maintenance of IT services. So there's, you may start, experiencing some deja vu, like I'm saying the same thing over and over again. But it really is important that everyone kind of have that objective at the core of their purpose, and then their specific role in the process is what sort of differentiates them. So governance is playing a decision-making role, is holding management accountable for creating value for the rest of the organization. And then management is doing all of these things. So management is really, as the word implies, about managing, that IT department or function. So it requires coordination, coordinating the activities of a variety of different people potentially, or resources within the IT department. Management needs to organize and make sure that the IT systems are organized in a way that is cost effective and that's able to deliver value to the organization. Management is responsible for planning, putting together a roadmap for where IT is going, and a roadmap that is aligned with the business needs of the organization, that's aligned with the overall strategy of the organization. Management is responsible for putting the budget together. Again, like the governance is responsible for approving the budget, but that budget is being constructed and presented by management, the management function. And the second column is really all about communication, and that's why I put an exclamation mark by it, because the importance of communication cannot be underestimated, particularly when it comes to IT, because oftentimes, especially with smaller organizations, the people who are in the governance role don't have a background in IT. Now that's changing to some extent, and I think, more and more people are starting to, I think actually what I'm starting to experience more now is people who underestimate their own sort of ability to understand and make good IT decisions more so than people who lack the background. But it still requires, really good communication skills on the part of the person or people who are in the management role to really kind of communicate the value of the systems that are in place and the value that it's delivering to the rest of the organization. That value doesn't really exist if it's not sort of understood. So that's really important. Um, Collaboration is critical, and I think this is a big sea change that we've witnessed in the IT department over the last 5 to 10 years. The stereotype of the IT department is, the antisocial techie who's kind of behind a locked door and doesn't ever want to talk to anyone and wants to maintain a lot of control, kind of have a command and control attitude towards their IT systems. And that has really given way to the need for a more collaborative approach because people are now able to go out and get their own IT systems. They can go, shadow IT continues to be a big challenge in a lot of IT departments. Why should someone use your system if they can just go out and get their own? So collaboration is kind of a nice consequence of the consumerization of IT. Management needs to present and communicate, to the rest of the organization, what's happening, and then engage in that dialogue. So,
Yeah, Johan,
go ahead.
I do think that yeah, I mean the collaboration portion really can't be understated, and as you mentioned, there really is I think a fundamental change in IT and kind of what that IT department role has become from, the command and control top down. Here's the IT system, and you use it to enabling technology, enabling the effective use of technology tools wherever. Kind of meeting folks, departments or programs where they are in order to, help them use their technology tools effectively and integrate them into the other, the other areas of the organization. I do think that IT is uniquely positioned in the organization as, an entity that touches every aspect. So they kind of like finance or HR, does have a window into the organization broadly, and I think has a lot of value in being able to provide insight and wisdom as to how different groups within the organization are using technology. But yeah, the key is being able to collaborate and be willing and open to have that be part of the culture as opposed to enforcing technology solutions, which I think those days are numbered and may even be over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the IT manager is very much on par with other managers in the organization, and I think the expectation is that their job is to, work well with the other departments in the organization, collaborate, work in a coordinated and aligned manner, to achieve the overall objectives that the organization has.
Mm-hmm.
So who's the IT manager? I mean, the IT manager, that's who. The IT manager or director of IT, someone who's kind of involved in day-to-day, week-to-week management. For medium and larger size organizations, it's a necessary role. It's a very important role to have. For smaller organizations, there are times where, particularly for like 30 staff or less, just doesn't make sense necessarily to have an IT manager. In those cases, the director of operations may act as the IT manager, and I say director, but it could be the VP of operations, it could be the COO, depending on the size of the organization. I do think it's important that responsibility be written into their job description, and it be an explicit part of sort of their portfolio of responsibilities, not just as a hot potato, like, okay, who's taking on IT because we don't have an IT manager and no one else can do it. And so it's not just about making decisions, which you could have a situation where the director of operations also happens to be in the governance role, but it's all of those other activities that we listed on the previous slide: communicating, planning, budgeting, understanding the value that the IT systems are delivering to the rest of the organization. Those are all the responsibility of the IT manager, of the management role. And so if that's going to be, if that role or responsibility is going to be assigned to the director of operations or the administrative assistant, then, they need to understand that that's something that they're responsible for. And I think actually with, again, like the increasing sort of move of systems out to the cloud, the move away with the hardware layer, let's call it, or the network infrastructure layer becoming increasingly abstracted, it actually, I think, becomes easier to understand the value that things like Salesforce or Office 365 as your email system kind of deliver to the rest of the organization. So let's move on. So let's read the tea leaves. That's what these are, tea leaves. What are the signs of good governance and good management? I know everything we've talked about, it sounds great on PowerPoint and it's, a nice dream, but does it really exist? What are some of the signs of good governance? So we'll share ours, and if you have some that you've experienced, we invite you to share those with us through the questions. So good governance. A CFO or COO who owns their role. They accept that they are going to be making key decisions around IT. And we've certainly worked with plenty of chief, financial, operational, even executive officers who are taking responsibility for that and want to, ask great questions. In fact, in my experience, the best questions come from the executives who say, okay, I don't know anything about IT, and this is probably going to be a really dumb question. And then they ask a really insightful, probing question that gets to the heart of the matter and sort of connects IT with, their business needs. So that's always a good sign. I think if the board is making IT a priority, and increasingly we're seeing boards that have IT professionals on the board, that is generally a good sign, especially to the extent that boards sort of set the priorities for nonprofit organizations. Having regular meetings, as we had mentioned earlier, like that dialogue between governance and management is key. That dialogue doesn't just happen spontaneously. It really needs to be fostered through good process. And something as simple as a weekly, monthly meeting can do wonders for building up that dialogue. Just having a basic agenda, kind of running through it every week, is a great way to kind of generate more understanding around the IT services that exist in an organization. Good governance is getting involved in the planning, making sure that IT planning is part of the overall planning process and not just something that's kind of stuck in an appendix at the end. Good governance is also reporting. So I think good, if by extension, like think about good financial governance, right? Good financial governance means the board or the senior leadership team, they're looking at financial reports on a regular basis, monthly, quarterly, whatever the case may be. They want to make sure that the financial stewardship of the organization is happening effectively. In the same way, you should have IT reports that show you, how the IT resources and assets of the organization are being managed. So reporting and key metrics are also a sign that good governance is happening. Not a guarantee, but a sign. So those are some of the signs of good governance. Let's talk a little bit about signs of good management. So signs of good management. And a good IT manager, someone who understands the business needs of the organization. And this doesn't need to be they don't need to have an MBA and they're, have copies of HBR sitting on their desk, but it means that if the communications department has a certain requirement for their webinars, that the IT manager understands that requirement, respects it, and is seeking out systems that can fulfill that requirement. That's a simple example, but that's a business need, and so being able to just sort of understand the business needs and then figure out what IT solutions will help meet those business needs is a critical sign, of good management. Understanding the value of IT and investments. This may seem a little strange. Like, of course, the IT manager understands the value of IT. But that's not always the case. And I think, again, if the IT manager is just looking at the systems, the IT systems, and not looking at the way in which those systems enable and support business processes throughout the organization, then they actually don't understand the value, of IT. So it's really moving from understanding the cost of an IT system to understanding on some level, and it doesn't necessarily need to be quantified, but on some level being able to understand and articulate how that system is supporting the mission of the organization.
And I think that's a really good point that probably can't be understated. And I think, speaking, again, as an IT professional, we, are probably our own worst enemies in this regard. I know, we have conversations with other IT folks, and kind of the first thing out of their mouth is, well, I've done a really good job to kind of save the organization money. And the saving of the money has meant having very old equipment that doesn't run very well, spending a lot of time focused on repairs as opposed to using the technology tools. And so I think in those cases, if the focus is on saving money by not spending or kind of investing in kind of maintenance as opposed to new capacity, that really is a disservice to the IT function in the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like saving money and delivering value are two different things. And now cost control is very important. And, at a nonprofit organization in particular, you have to be, judicious and a good steward of the resources of the organization. But investments that don't deliver value, that aren't generating a return for the organization, and that in some cases can be even worse.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, understanding oftentimes leads to communication, but not always. And I think it's important that, again, like the manager be someone who is a good communicator and also a good advocate. Like the governance function may be willing, but they may also need to be prodded. And so I think IT needs to kind of stand up for itself and, sort of say, well, we've got to get a faster internet connection because everyone's doing everything in the cloud, and that's just really important for people to work efficiently and for us to have access to the services that are helping us accomplish our mission. So advocacy is an important part of good management. And then obviously basic management skills, not necessarily technical skills. And I think this is also an important distinction to make, that whoever's in the IT manager role, if you're looking to fill an IT manager role, if you're creating a new IT manager position, it's the management skills that are in many ways more important than the technical skills. Obviously, a technical background is important, and the ability to understand technical concepts is important, but having someone who's really strong technically is going to be a problem if they don't have good management skills. So just to reiterate, governance is critical, management's critical. Those are the things that are needed in order for the IT department to be successful. And as Matt has mentioned, and we've mentioned a few times, it's really about a dialogue. So you could organize this chart in a variety of different ways, but it's really about these different elements kind of working together in concert. So let's talk about the IT department then. We spent a lot of time talking about what the rest of the organization needs to look like. What is the structure, or what's a good way of thinking about how to structure your IT department? And we like to think about it with these 4 categories. So there's really kind of 4 roles that the IT department needs to play. And we went back and forth on whether to use the term CIO for that first role, because it seems a little silly to have the CIO, who potentially could be at the top of the org chart, kind of all the way down here. And part of the reason for that is, it's a nice sort of 3 letters that fit within the square. And also in our world, the world of managed service providers, you will see people kind of promoting a VCIO, or virtual CIO service. And the VCIO sort of role relates to kind of that function. So There's probably a more accurate term for it than CIO, but it's kind of a nice signifier of what that role is about, and that's actually the next slide, so I'll get to that in a second. So there's CIO. PMO is Project Management Office, and I think it's become pretty common now that, especially in larger organizations, that the PMO sort of evolves out of the IT department, and I think it's a reflection of the fact that in a lot of organizations, the complexity and scale of IT projects has required the IT department or function to really develop a lot of project management ability or capabilities, and then that can be kind of spun out and used for other projects in the organization as well. There's an engineer role, and then finally a help desk. We'll talk about these in more detail.
So,
oh, sorry, Matt, go ahead.
Before we over the kind of the more detailed descriptions, one thing that does seem to be missing from this model is the role of what maybe has been called the IS role, or the Information Systems Department. So how would you kind of see that fitting into, or relating to the IT department?
Yeah, that's a good question. So IT, information technology, I think commonly, refers to sort of the systems themselves, like the systems are running, they're accessible, they're integrated, they're secured. And IS, information systems, kind of refers to the data within those, systems. How is the data being used by the organization? How is it being sort of analyzed? And like statistical analysis for organizations that are gathering a lot of statistical data, for example. So IS could be a separate department, or it could be a joint department with what we're calling the IT department that would add then some additional roles beyond the ones listed here. And generally, the CIO kind of has the most sort of interaction with the IS department, but certainly the help desk could be trained to respond not only to sort of IT requests, like my computer isn't booting up, I'm having trouble printing. They could be trained to also respond to IS requests, like the data in this database is, it's not clean, or there's a lot of bad data that needs to be cleaned out, et cetera, et cetera. But it's kind of yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Matt. It's kind of a separate function. So the CIO,
Great.
yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. The CIO is really responsible for technical planning. So that's a role within the IT department. Works closely with the manager. The manager is kind of responsible for planning overall, like coming up with a good plan for the organization, but thinking through the different technical solutions that are available and identifying the solution that's going to best meet the business needs of the organization. That is kind of more of a specific technical skill that someone within the IT department needs to have. And that could be the IT manager, but not necessarily. It's someone who can do sort of more detailed business analysis and requirements gathering. So an organization, maybe for their CRM to reach out to their constituents, they're using a spreadsheet. The CIO would maybe meet with that team and help them formulate the requirements for looking at getting a new CRM, and then that would go on to the overall roadmap of the organization. CIO would help with evaluating different solutions, and then work with engineering to kind of come up with an overall network architecture and design. PMO, Project Management Office, is responsible for project management. It sounds pretty straightforward. It mostly is, actually. So just having the ability to manage projects, basically put together a timeline, establish deliverables, define the scope of the project, make sure that activities are happening in a coordinated manner, that adjustments to the timeline and the cost of the project are being managed over the course of the project, delivering deployment of the solutions according to the timeline, adjusting the timeline as needed based on unforeseen events that happen over the course of the project, basic kind of project management skills, which may or may not be purely IT related, although generally IT projects, are a little bit different from, let's say, a, program-driven project, a construction project. So having the IT background is important. What's, I think, maybe more important and oftentimes forgotten is change management. And if you're basically if you're responsible for an IT project, which generally means implementing or deploying a new solution, you're responsible for changing how the staff in the organization work. So you're rolling out a new email system, and maybe it's a little bit different on the back end, but the front end looks the same, or you're rolling out a new document management solution, and how they get to their documents and share them and work on them is completely different. And you can't just roll the solution out and sort of say, here it is, good luck. As we've all learned, technology adoption is actually as critical, if not more critical and important than actually getting the solution itself, the system itself, up and running. And so increasingly, the project management office also needs to be responsible for the change management that's required in rolling out new IT solutions. And that means that they're responsible also for user adoption. So they need to kind of have that expertise and skill set as well. Engineering. So engineering is kind of, what people sort of traditionally, I think of when they think of the IT department. Again, it's that, the person with a lot of advanced technical knowledge and expertise that may or may not be interacting with the rest of the organization. And I hate to denigrate that stereotype, the person that stereotype represents, maybe, because I think to some degree it's unfair. People who have advanced engineering skills are very good at what they do, and just as you wouldn't necessarily ask your CFO to also be the motivational speaker for your organization and kind of get everyone fired up for the new whatever initiative, I think it's also to some extent unfair to expect that your engineers be responsible for change management and business analysis and on good management of the IT system. There are people who have advanced technical skills who can do those other things. But it's not, it's not always the case, and it's a very different skill set. And I think this is a unique role. It needs to be filled, and the work that the engineer does is very important. So it includes network architecture maintenance, so kind of maintaining, the connectivity between all of the information systems, whether that's making sure that your laptop is connecting to the wireless and can get to the internet, or making sure that when you're at home you can connect through the VPN to your server at work, et cetera, et cetera. The engineer is responsible for providing advanced technical support. Anything that the help desk can't resolve, the engineer is responsible for. Planning out and maintaining the integration between different systems. And then finally, information security, which is at least one other webinar unto itself. Making sure that information is, confidential, has integrity, and is available. So protecting the network from viruses, from intrusion, protecting information from leaking out of the network. There's just that's a whole area, a whole discipline. And then finally, there's the help desk. Help desk is responsible for end user support. So that's pretty self-explanatory. People are having problems. They need to submit tickets and get support for them. That's end user support, responding to incidents, where the definition of an incident is basically an IT system that's unavailable. So the help desk is responsible for that, providing basic access management and resolving basic technical issues. And as good as technology gets, there's still, a lot of issues that happen anytime you're using technical systems, you're going to have technical issues that require, kind of basic end user support. So let's talk a little bit about staffing. How you're thinking to yourself, okay, I'm a 30-person organization. Now I'm supposed to have governance and an IT manager, and, a CIO planner, business analyst, a project manager, and an engineer and a help desk, that would be like a third of the organization dedicated to IT. So we one of the reports that we find the most valuable comes from N10, and that is the Nonprofit Technology Staffing and Investments Report. They've been doing it for almost a decade now, and the 9th annual one was released, I think maybe it was almost a year ago. Anyways, if you're a member of N10, you can go log into the portal, do a search for it, you'll find it. You can download it and look at it. It's incredibly detailed. It has a ton of information. If you're ever wondering like what's the benchmark, like how do I sort of stack up to other nonprofits? Am I underinvesting? Am I overinvesting? This is the report that you should be looking at. So it's a great resource. I can't recommend it enough. And based on this report, what N10 found is that mid to large size organizations, which they define as having a budget between 1 and 10 million, mid to large size organizations that were successful at IT had one IT staff person for every 20 to 25 staff. So if you have a 30-person organization, you should have at least one IT staff person in that organization. If you have a 50-person organization, you should plan to have 2, and so on and so forth. So that's a good rule of thumb for thinking about how to staff IT in your organization. Now it would be going too far to kind of think of this as a one-size-fits-all rule of thumb. If the mission of your organization is about collecting data and crunching data and generating reports, then IT is probably more integral to your success, and you might need to have more staff than this rule of thumb would indicate. But it's a good starting point. And then they also looked at, just kind of as an aside, they looked at non-IT staff salary IT budget, so investment in sort of systems and solutions, and that was between $100,000 and $250,000 per year. So anywhere from 1 to 10%, depending on the size of the organization and their needs.
Yeah, and I went ahead and put the link to the N10 report in the chat field, so go ahead and you can access that report. It's a great resource.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Matt. So then you're okay. So based on the number of staff that you have, if you're following the N10 rule of thumb, how do you allocate those staff among all of these different roles, which can be challenging because, as I said before, IT manager skills are different from technical skills. So kudos if you can find someone who's a great manager and also a really good engineer, but it can be challenging. And I think if you're gonna have to pick where to hire, you're gonna have to, or how to staff your IT department, you're gonna have to you have to think carefully about it and make some good decisions about where you're gonna invest your resources. So these are 4 criteria that I think are helpful in thinking about how to allocate your staffing resources amongst those different roles of the IT department. So think about ongoing versus occasional. Which of those functions are going to be needed all the time versus which of those are you going to only need every once in a while. Time requirement. Which of those roles or functions are going to take up 20, 30 hours a week, and which are only 5 to 10 hours a week. Which roles require a knowledge of the organization, and which roles require more specialized technical knowledge. So if we kind of look at these different criteria and apply them against this chart, kind of say, okay, help desk, you probably need a help desk all the time. Now, depending on the size of your organization, is that going to be, in terms of time required, is that going to be you think you'll need about 10 hours a week staffing a help desk, or do you think it's going to be more like 40 hours a week? And that really varies widely from organization to organization. Is it more important for the help desk to have knowledge of the organization, or is it more important for it to have technical knowledge? Or what level of organizational knowledge is needed versus, technical knowledge? And again, like, this is going to vary from organization to organization depending on its specific structure, its mission, how it functions. So it's going to vary. But a PMO, if you're rolling out, a lot of IT projects, and if rolling out new IT solutions is a fundamental part of the organization, then, it may make sense to invest in a PMO in-house. But if you're only, deploying new IT solutions every 2 or 3 years, then that may be a function that it makes more sense to outsource. In general, our sort of guidance is that the farther sort of up you go, the less effective it is to outsource. And so it can be very effective to kind of rely on outside consultants and support for fulfilling things like the CIO and PMO function, particularly if those aren't happening very often, or the engineer function if the requirement is pretty minimal and it requires someone with pretty advanced technical knowledge. But once you get up into the management level, it starts to become less and less effective to outsource, generally because management tends to require more of a time commitment, and also requires greater knowledge of the organization, to the point where I think it's not possible to outsource the governance. In our experience, IT governance can't be outsourced. It's sort of abdicating. It's equivalent to abdicating responsibility for making IT decisions for the organization. So could start with looking down there in the 4 roles, based on these criteria, which one does it make more sense to outsource, and which one does it make more sense to try to build up in-house. So that takes us to the end, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions. Before we get to that, I want to just quickly announce next month's webinar, which is really going to focus on the CIO and PMO functions. So planning and IT project management for nonprofits. How can that be done effectively? What are some ways that you can do that yourself? What are some ways in which outsourcing it might be effective? We'll look at that in more detail. We always really appreciate the feedback that we get after these webinars, and if you don't mind taking the short survey once you exit the webinar, it really helps us in designing and planning these. If you missed anything, if you want to go back and look at something again, or strongly encourage sharing. If you want to share today's webinar with someone who you think might appreciate it or get value from it, we will be posting the webinar, slides and recording to our YouTube and SlideShare accounts. And we invite you to connect with us on Facebook, on our YouTube channel, LinkedIn, and you can check out our blog on our website. So with that, we'll have a little bit of time, maybe. How much time do we have, Matt, for questions?
Well, we're right at 5 o'clock. We do have a few questions here, so we'll take them. Starting off with actually a comment that I thought was good, going back to the role of the PMO. So in addition to managing projects, the comment was that the PMO is also great to help manage demand management, requests for new projects, and then the overall project management tracking, so portfolio management. So how many different IT initiatives are on the slate? How can we prioritize and manage all of the different requests that are coming in? So in addition to, the actual execution of the projects, also having that visibility kind of organization-wide into what's going on, what's the priority, and how are we allocating resources to that. The question then comes back to the question, a specific question for a 30-person nonprofit. Would you hire an in-house help desk person or only outsource? Do you have any specific guidance for that stereotypical 30-person organization?
Mm-hmm. Kind of going back to that chart of where it makes sense to outsource. It kind of depends on who's willing to take on the management role in the organization. So if this 30-person organization has a director of operations who's ready and willing to manage IT for the organization, then I think that one FTE could effectively go to a help desk person. that could respond to like basic issues, particularly if there's and this kind of gets to your question earlier, Matt, about the IT versus IS role and function within the organization. If it's an organization that relies really heavily on Salesforce, let's say, then if that's a person who could provide help desk support not only for basic computer issues but also for Salesforce, and you have a director of operations who's taking on the IT manager role, then hiring a help desk person could be very effective. If on the other hand it's a 30-person organization where there's no one playing that IT manager role, that is critical, and that would be the place to start.
Great. Thanks for that. All right. Well, I think that just about wraps up the questions. We do have one more. So question around, does our model at Community IT focus on complete outsourcing or supplementary form?
Or
Johan, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we work with 5-person organizations, and we work with 250-person organizations. And obviously with the larger organizations, they have a full service in-house IT department, and we're doing more sort of supplemental capacity. So there's certain things that we can do, I think, more cost effectively for large organizations. So we'll come in and do that kind of on the engineering side. And then very large projects that we have a lot of experience with, we'll come in and kind of supplement, their in-house kind of PMO function. And then for smaller organizations, aside from the IT management role, we'll play, we can provide help desk, engineering, PMO, and CIO kind of planning support. So we're really kind of able to scale through a variety of sizes and more or less provide, the support that the organization needs, depending on what they're sort of capable of doing in-house. We can provide the management function, but in those situations, we're really looking to kind of partner with the organization, because I think, in our experience, we can do a fair amount of IT management, particularly when it's connected to sort of technical knowledge, but there always needs to be that person in the organization who really understands the organization and is able to communicate with the key decision makers and stakeholders.
Yeah, and I would, I guess, just follow along on that. I mean, our approach, and we've been around since 1993, is to be kind of flexible and a partner. I think it is important, if you are looking for an IT vendor to use to kind of figure out what their kind of view is. There are a lot of IT vendors where they do provide kind of a standardized and pretty structured service offering, and that's all they do is kind of complete outsourcing. You kind of turn over control of the IT function to them, and I think that can be pretty constraining in some cases if you need to have some flexibility in that work role. I think it can be appealing to just feel like you can turn the keys over and have somebody else deal with it, but as Johan mentioned, the role of kind of IT management and really getting back to the function of IT is really enabling that process and aligning the business needs and providing value. It's really hard to do that if you're just kind of handing over the keys to another organization to kind of provide a commodity service.
It can be successful, but again, it kind of gets back to governance. Governance, if there's one message you get out of this webinar, it's the importance of governance, and the number one job of governance is accountability, and it's a very specific type of accountability. So it's not enough to say, look, I just want IT to work. Governance really needs to be intentional about fostering that growth in both business alignment and management capability. And outsourced or even commodity service IT support can play a role effectively within that approach, but it just needs to be done in an intentional way.
Great. Good. Well, I think that's a great comment to conclude our webinar on today. Thanks, Johan. I appreciate all the great insights you shared with us today.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Thanks, everyone.